Hello students, coming to the embryology part 2, the development of phase. So in the first part, we've seen the pharyngeal arches, we have seen the ectodermal clefts, endodermal pouches, the development of thyroid gland, and we have seen the development of tongue in the lecture of tongue. Here, let us understand the development of phase. Okay, let us understand the development of phase. Now, students, what happens in the last lecture, I told you that's the mouth here. When the embryo is folded, that's the mouth. That's the developing brain. That's the developing heart. There's no neck. So this is the mouth. That's the neural tube. The brain. That's the heart. Now the first pharyngeal arch comes here. The first pharyngeal arch comes here. The first pharyngeal arch divides into two processes. It divides into two maxillary processes and the two mandibular processes. Two maxillary and two mandibular processes. So just have a look at this. If I have to draw it, I will be drawing it like this. So that's the developing. Okay. So that's the developing brain here. I'll write it like this. That's the developing brain. That's the developing heart here. Okay. That's the developing heart. That's the mouth. That's the developing mouth. And the first pharyngeal arch appears here. The first pharyngeal arch divides into two processes. This is the maxillary process and that's the mandibular process. That's the first pharyngeal arch. So I write this as the maxillary process and I write this as the mandibular process. Mandibular process. So this maxilla mandibular are also derived from the first pharyngeal arch. The first pharyngeal arch, this is the maxillary process, that's the mandibular process, right? So that's the mouth, that's the neural tube, that's the developing heart. The first pharyngeal arch comes here, divides into a maxillary process and a mandibular process. Now, in the next step, what happens? In the next step, look. Clear now? This much is clear. So that's the mouth here. I'll write this as the mouth. That's the developing neural tube or the brain. The mesoderm overgrows the neural tube. The mesoderm grows over the neural tube and forms a process here. So I'll write it like this. The mesoderm grows over the neural tube and this process is known as the frontonasal process. The frontonasal process. So the mesoderm overgrows the neural tube and forms the frontonasal process. Clear? Now, what is this process? That's the maxillary process here. That's the maxillary process and the mandibular processes of the both the sides, they fuse. The mandibular process fuse. So I'll write this as the mandibular process. Mandibular process fuse, that's the developing heart now. Heart. Clear? So that's the mouth. The mandibular processes are fused here. The fused mandibular processes are going to form the lower jaw and the lower lip. The lower jaw and the lower lip is formed by the fusion of two mandibular processes. So suppose if this two mandibular processes does not fuse, we get a cleft right here in the midline. Students, what do you call this cleft in the midline as? This is what we call as a midline lower lip cleft. Midline lower lip cleft, and this midline lower lip cleft is due to non-fusion of two mandibular processes. Non-fusion of two mandibular processes. Clear? So now mandible is formed. So what are we left with? We are left with the frontonasal process and we are left with the two maxillary process. We are left with the frontonasal process and the two maxillary process. Just try to understand this. Now see, in the next step, what happens? I draw this as the mouth here. I'll draw this as the mouth. I'll draw this as the frontonasal process. What is frontonasal process? The mesoderm overgrows the neural tube and forms a frontonasal process. Mesoderm overgrows the brain and forms a frontonasal process. In this frontonasal process, we get two small depressions here. Look at this. We get two small depressions for the nose. So we get two small depressions here for the nose. And the moment there's a depression here, the mesoderm around it becomes elevated. The mesoderm becomes elevated, right? So there will be a elevation here on the medial side. There's going to be an elevation here like this. Because there's a depression, there's going to be an elevation on the medial side and on the lateral side like this. So there's going to be an elevation on the medial and the lateral side. Clear, no? There's a depression. So the moment there's a depression here, the mesoderm is going to heap up. It forms an elevation. What is this in red known as? This in red is known as the lateral nasal process. Lateral nasal process. Okay, and the one in green is known as the medial nasal process. The one in green, that's the medial, okay, nasal process. Medial nasal process. Clear? These are the parts of frontonasal process. So frontonasal process differentiates into a medial nasal and a lateral nasal process. Now students, what is this process here? What is this process? That's the maxillary process on both the sides. And what is this process here? What is this process here? That's the mandibular process. That's our mandibular process. Okay, or I'll just take it down slightly. I'll take it down slightly. Okay, fine. Look at this now. So this is the maxillary process and that's the mandibular process. Maxillary and mandibular process. So this is the mandibular process and that's the maxillary process. Clear to all of you? So the frontonasal process has differentiated into a medial nasal process, a lateral nasal process, and what is this now? Maxillary process. So now the developing mouth is surrounded by 5 processes. One is the frontonasal process with the medial nasal and the lateral nasal process. The 2 maxillary process and the mandibular processes are fused. So these are the 5 processes. 1 frontonasal, 1 mandibular, and 2 maxillary processes. To begin with, there were 2 mandibular processes also, so that becomes 5. Now the mandibular processes fuse. So forget the mandibular process now. Now what are we going to concentrate upon? The frontonasal process with the lateral and the medial nasal process and the maxillary process. Following this, now see what happens next. Now this, okay, I'll draw a slide for you once again here. I'll draw a slide for you here. So I'll draw this as the nasal pit here. I'll draw this as the medial nasal process here for you, the medial nasal process. I draw the lateral nasal process here for you. That's a lateral nasal process. Okay. Now, the maxillary process would come like this, like this, like this. The maxillary process will first fuse with the lateral nasal process. The maxillary process will then fuse with the medial nasal process. The maxillary process will fuse with the lateral nasal process and then will fuse with the medial nasal process. And what is this process? Mandibular process. That's the mandibular process and that's the mouth. Okay, now just see the slide which I'm going to show you. The same slide I'll show you. Look at this. Students, so what is this here? What is this going to be? This is the mouth. Okay, that's the mouth. So that's the developing heart here. That's the developing heart. That's the developing brain here. Brain. Okay, that's the brain. And what is this process which overlies the brain known as? That's the frontonasal process. Okay, this process is what we call as the frontonasal process. That's the frontonasal process. Frontonasal process. Now, what is this in the frontonasal process? What is this? This is the nasal pit. That's a nasal pit. And because of the formation of this nasal pit, there is an elevation here. Now, what is this known as? What is this known as? This is the lateral nasal process and this is the medial nasal process, right? Same here. That's the medial nasal process and that's the lateral nasal process. Clear? Fine. You know this now. What is this process here? What is this process? That's the maxillary process. That's the maxillary process and this is the mandibular process, which is fused. Mandibular process is fused here. And where is the mouth, students? Where is the mouth? This is the mouth. This is going to be the mouth. Are you following? Are you able to follow this? So now the mouth is surrounded by, number 1 is the frontonasal process with its 2 processes, the medial nasal process and the lateral nasal process. These are the 2 maxillary processes. The mandibular processes are fused to form the lower jaw and the lower lip. Fine. Now try to understand this. The maxillary processes are coming closer, closer, closer. The maxillary process will come closer. Look at this and look at this. The maxillary processes are coming closer. They first fuse with the lateral nasal process and then with the medial nasal process. But as the maxillary processes are coming closer, 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 these 2 medial nasal processes are also coming closer. Look at this slide. The 2 medial nasal processes comes closer. Now the maxillary process comes further, further, further close. The 2 medial nasal processes comes very close. The 2 medial nasal processes comes very close. Look, they fuse here. They fuse here. As the maxillary process is coming towards the midline, the 2 medial nasal processes approach each other. They fuse and they form this. What is this known as? This is what we call as philtrum of the upper lip. Philtrum of the upper lip, right? So philtrum of the upper lip is formed due to fusion of what? Two medial nasal processes. Are you following this? The maxillary processes are coming closer. The two medial nasal processes comes close. They fuse. They form the philtrum of the upper lip. So philtrum of the upper lip is formed due to fusion of the two medial nasal processes. If this two medial nasal processes does not fuse, we get a cleft here. We get a cleft right in the midline. And this is what we call as a midline upper lip cleft. If they do not fuse, we get a cleft here, and this is what we call as a midline upper lip cleft, non-fusion of two medial nasal process. Following this, okay. Now the maxillary process will fuse with the lateral nasal process first, and then will fuse with the medial nasal process on both the sides. The maxillary will fuse with the lateral and then with the medial nasal process. Now suppose if this maxillary process does not fuse with the medial nasal process. Look, if this maxillary process does not fuse with the medial nasal process, we get a cleft here. It can be unilateral or it can be bilateral. Are you following this? You see, this patients are very common. A cleft here. This, you've seen a rabbit has got a cleft here. So this is what we call as a hair lip or a cleft lip. So hair lip or cleft lip is due to non-fusion of the maxillary process with medial nasal process. Maxillary with the medial nasal process, right? So that is a hair lip or a cleft lip. And finally, this maxillary process, when it fuses, suppose if it doesn't fuse with the lateral nasal process, we get a cleft extending from the eye to the upper lip. That's how the cleft is going to be, from the eye to the upper lip, and this is what we call as an oblique facial cleft. Oblique facial cleft. Are you following this? Look at this slide. So what is this, student? What is this? That's the medial nasal process on both the sides. Medial nasal process. That's the lateral nasal process here. Lateral nasal process. What is this? Maxillary process here. Maxillary process here. That's the mandibular process, and that's the mouth. So the maxillary process is coming closer. The two medial nasal processes fuse, and what they form here now? What are they going to form here is the philtrum. They will form the philtrum here, right? The two medial nasal processes will form the philtrum here. The maxillary process will fuse with the medial nasal process. If it does not fuse, hair lip. If it does not fuse with the lateral nasal process, we get a long cleft, and that is what we call as a oblique facial cleft. Oblique facial cleft. So we'll just write this down, students. We'll just write this down. Midline upper lip cleft. Midline upper lip cleft. Midline upper lip cleft. Yes, what is it due to? Non-fusion of two medial nasal process. Non-fusion of two medial nasal process. That is midline upper lip cleft. The second one is hair lip or cleft lip. Hair lip or cleft lip. How's this? Non-fusion of, I'm not writing that non-fusion of maxillary process with medial nasal process. Non-fusion of maxillary process with the medial nasal process. That is hair lip or cleft lip. It can be unilateral or bilateral. Non-fusion of maxillary process with medial nasal process. The third one is oblique facial cleft. Oblique facial cleft. Non-fusion of maxillary process with lateral nasal process. Lateral nasal process. Non-fusion of maxillary process with lateral nasal process. That's an oblique facial cleft. And the last one is midline lower lip cleft. Midline lower lip cleft. Non-fusion of two mandibular process. Non-fusion of two mandibular process leads to a midline lower lip cleft. Clear, students? This is what you're supposed to know in the development of face. Have a look at this slide and just let me know if you can understand this. What is this cleft? Students, have a look. What is this cleft? What is this cleft? This is a cleft which is formed in the midline, in the upper lip. Yeah, that's a midline upper lip cleft. Non-fusion of two medial nasal process. Non-fusion of two medial nasal process. What is this? Look at this. This is a hair lip, but it is a unilateral hair lip. And what is this? That's a bilateral hair lip. Bilateral hair lip. Non-fusion of maxillary process with medial nasal process. So that's maxillary process. That's a medial nasal process. Does not fuse. So a hair lip or a cleft lip. What is this now? What is this? This is non-fusion of maxillary process with the lateral nasal process, and this is what we call as the oblique facial cleft. Oblique facial cleft. And if there's an oblique facial cleft, there's a duct here which is exposed, which runs from the eye to the nose. That's the nasolacrimal duct. So the nasolacrimal duct is exposed in case of oblique facial cleft. Clear, students? I hope this is clear to all of you. Yes. What is this? Can anyone tell me what is this? A very common clinical presentation that we get in the OPDs. This is a midline, this is a hair lip or a cleft lip. Non-fusion of what is this process here? That's the maxillary process with what is this process? That's a medial nasal process. Clear? If the cleft is here, if the cleft is right in the midline here, it would be a midline upper lip cleft, non-fusion of two medial nasal process. This is a hair lip, non-fusion of maxillary process with medial nasal process. And if the maxillary process does not fuse with the lateral nasal process, we'll get a cleft like this. That's a oblique facial cleft, right? And if there's a cleft here, this is a midline lower lip cleft, non-fusion of two mandibular processes. Clear, students? I hope this is clear to all of you. Huh? Okay. Now, that was the development of face. Clear. Now understand, just remember the MCQs which are asked in the exams. I've told you the answers for those MCQs. Now you're looking like this. What is this bone? Maxilla. And you're looking like this from here. The maxilla, okay, just before that, the two medial nasal processes here, they fuse, they form what? Philtrum. I've told you one thing, it forms a philtrum. So the two medial nasal processes fuse to form, number one is the philtrum of the upper lip. Yes, they form two more things. They form this upper jaw in which the four incisors are there. Four incisors, yeah. This part of the upper jaw in which the four incisors are located. So what is this? This is the philtrum of the upper lip. You're looking like this, huh? You're looking like this. So that's a philtrum of the upper lip, the upper jaw with four incisors, and it forms a small part of the palate. Look at this part of the palate. This is what we call as the primary palate. Primary palate, or this is what we call as the primitive palate. Primitive palate. So we're talking about the development of hard palate. Hard palate is made up of two sources. One is the primary palate, the other one is the secondary palate. How is this primary palate formed? The primary palate is derived from the fusion of two medial nasal processes. Fusion of two medial nasal processes, that forms the primary palate. Now that's the maxilla bone, and this maxilla will be sending two processes like this. Okay, from here and from here. You're looking like this. So the maxilla will be sending one process from here, one process from here. Look at this. So this maxilla will be sending one process from this side and one process from this side. And these two processes are going to fuse in the midline. What do we call this process as? This is known as the palatine process of maxilla. Palatine process of maxilla. So this palatine process of maxilla are going to fuse with each other here. Also, they fuse with this primary palate. Understanding this? So the two palatine processes of maxilla will fuse with each other, and they will fuse with the primary palate. And this entire thing that we are going to get here is the is the hard palate. That's the hard palate, right? But again, there can be complications here. There can be complications. Suppose if this two palatine process does not fuse with each other like this, and they do not fuse with the primary palate. They do not fuse with each other, and they do not fuse with the primary palate. We get a Y-shaped defect. Are you able to follow this? This is the Y-shaped defect. If the two palatine processes do not fuse with each other and the primary palate, it's a Y-shaped defect. Now, If these two palatine processes of maxilla, they fuse with each other, but they do not fuse with the primary palate. They do not fuse with the primary palate. What is the shape of defect that we get? A V-shaped defect. That's how we get a defective palate, defective hard palate. I'll explain this once again. Now, how do we know in our hard palate, how do we know which is primary and which is secondary? Yes, any guesses? In our palate, how do we know which is our primary palate and which is our secondary palate? There's a small foramen up there. There's a small foramen. I know you all must be trying to feel it with your tongue. No, you can't feel that. It's a very small foramen. It's a very small foramen lying at the junction of the primary and the secondary palate here. And this foramen is what we call as the incisive foramen. Incisive foramen. So what differentiates between the primary and the secondary palate is the incisive foramen. Okay, I don't have, yeah. So here it will be the incisive foramen. Look at this slide. Look at this slide once again. So what is this? This is the primary palate. Okay, this is the primary palate which is derived from the fusion of two medial nasal processes. And what is this bone? This is the maxilla bone, maxilla. And what is this process? Palatine process of maxilla. These two palatine processes will come closer and they will fuse with the primary palate. And this is what we get the secondary palate. That's how the secondary palate is formed. Clear? Simple, easier. So understand the development of hard palate. I'll just put this on the paper. Hard palate. It is made up of two parts, primary and secondary. So primary is derived from fusion of two medial nasal process. Fusion of two medial nasal process. Okay. Secondary palate is derived from fusion of two palatine process. Palatine process of fusion of two palatine process of maxilla. So fusion of two palatine process of maxilla. Clear? So that's about the hard palate. And what differentiates in us between a primary and a secondary palate? What is there in us? The incisive foramen. Incisive foramen differentiates, lies at the junction of primary and the secondary palate. The incisive foramen lies at the junction of primary and secondary palate. Okay, students, I hope this is clear. I hope the slides are clear to all of you. In case there's anything not clear, you tell me. So just once again, look here. In quick, I'll tell you, that's the developing mouth. The mouth is surrounded by, one is the developing brain here, the developing heart here, and the first pharyngeal arch comes here, which divides into two maxillary processes and two mandibular processes. The mouth is now surrounded by two maxillary processes, two mandibular processes, and the developing brain. The two mandibular processes fuse with each other. If they do not fuse, we get a midline lower lip cleft. In this, the mesoderm grows over the neural tube and forms the frontonasal process. In this frontonasal process, we get the formation of two depressions for the nose. We call this as a nasal pit. The moment there's a depression here, the mesoderm gets elevated on the medial side. That's the medial nasal process. On the lateral side, that's the lateral nasal process. The maxillary process comes towards the midline. As it is coming towards the midline, the two medial nasal processes come closer, they fuse, and they form the philtrum of the upper lip. So philtrum of the upper lip is formed due to non-fusion of two medial nasal processes. If these two medial nasal processes do not fuse, we get a cleft in the midline. That's a midline upper lip cleft. The maxillary process now fuse with the lateral and then with the medial nasal process. If the maxillary process does not fuse with the medial nasal process, we get a cleft not in the midline but at a side. It can be unilateral or bilateral. This is what we call as a hair lip or a cleft lip. And finally, the maxillary process fuses with the lateral nasal process. If it does not fuse, it gives rise to an oblique facial cleft. I hope I'm clear to all of you. Hard palate is derived from two sources, primary, secondary. The primary palate is derived from the fusion of two medial nasal processes, and that is what we call as the premaxilla or the primary palate. The secondary palate is derived from the fusion of two palatine processes of maxilla. This two palatine process will come, they fuse with each other and they fuse with the primary palate. The incisive foramen differentiates between a primary and a secondary palate. If they do not fuse with each other nor with the primary palate, we get a Y-shaped defect. If the palatine processes fuse with each other but not with the primary palate, we get a V-shaped defect. Okay, so that's about the development of phase. Students, I hope this is all clear to you. Clear? I hope this is all clear to you. In case of doubts, do get back to me, students. Happy learning till then. Thank you. Thank you to all of you.